For decades, the old log cabin sat hidden behind a tangle of brush on the edge of Grandpa Jones's property, its shutters nailed shut, its door sealed with a heavy rusted lock no one dared to break. To outsiders, it was just a relic from another time. But to those who knew Louis Marshall, Grandpa Jones, the banjo-picking legend of Hee Haw, it was a place wrapped in whispers. He had told his family it was off-limits and warned them never to go inside, his voice carrying a weight that silenced any questions. After his death, the cabin stood untouched, slowly surrendering to the weeds and shadows. Some said it held old instruments or forgotten keepsakes. Others thought it was just a shed. But when the door was finally forced open after decades of mystery, the darkness inside revealed something so unsettling it would forever change how they remembered him and what they thought they knew about the man behind the banjo. Before the cabin became a source of rumor and unease, Grandpa Jones was one of the most beloved figures in American country music. Born in 1913 in the small town of Niagara, Kentucky, Louis Marshall, Grandpa Jones carved out a career that made him a staple on the Grand Ole Opry stage and later a fan favorite on the hit TV show Hee Haw. His trademark overalls, bow tie, and beaming smile were paired with lightning-fast banjo-picking and a warm, folksy humor that made audiences feel like they were sitting in his living room. On screen, he was the embodiment of joy, a man who could turn any tune into a toe-tapping celebration. Offstage, he was private, disciplined, and fiercely protective of his home life. He bought a sprawling piece of property in rural Tennessee, where he could escape the demands of fame, a place filled with fields, woods, and a winding creek. It was here, tucked away in a clearing far from the main house, that he built the log cabin in the early 1950s. He told friends it was just a quiet place for thinking, but even those closest to him noticed something strange. No one was ever invited inside, not his children, not his fellow Opry performers, not even Ramona, his wife. When people asked about it, he would chuckle and say, "A man's got to have his secrets," and change the subject. As the years passed, the cabin became part of the local lore, a silent and unyielding presence on the edge of his property. Some thought it was filled with rare collectibles or valuable music memorabilia. Others imagined stacks of handwritten songs never shared with the world. But there were also whispers of darker things. Tales of odd deliveries arriving at the cabin's door, strange lights flickering inside late at night, and the occasional sound of footsteps in the woods when Grandpa was supposedly away on tour. Whatever truth lay inside, Grandpa Jones took it to his grave when he passed in 1998, leaving behind not just a musical legacy, but a locked door no one dared open. Over the years, the mystery of the cabin deepened, fed by strange encounters and hushed conversations. Neighbors spoke of nights when the woods behind Grandpa Jones's property seemed alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees under the glow of a harvest moon. A delivery driver swore that on one foggy morning, as he dropped off supplies at the main house, he caught sight of faint candlelight flickering through the cabin's boarded windows, even though Grandpa was supposedly asleep inside. Another local claimed he once heard banjo music drifting from the direction of the cabin, but the tune was slow, haunting, nothing like the joyous melodies Grandpa played on stage. Family members had their own unsettling memories. One night at the dinner table, his youngest son, half joking, half curious, asked if there was treasure in the cabin. The laughter died instantly when Grandpa slammed his palm against the table, his eyes hard and unblinking. "You stay out of there," he said firmly. "Promise me." The sharpness in his voice was so unlike his usual gentle demeanor that no one dared speak of it again. Even in his later years, when his health began to decline, he remained protective of that locked door. On nights when he couldn't sleep, Ramona recalled seeing him take a lantern and disappear toward the clearing, returning hours later without a word. If visitors happened to wander too close, he'd appear suddenly, smiling but with an edge in his tone, gently steering them away. After his death, the cabin became an even more haunting presence. Its wood darkened by time, The lock rusted but still holding strong. The family debated opening it, but out of respect, or maybe fear, they left it alone. Until one fateful night, nature itself would shatter the barrier that had stood for over half a century. It happened on a stormy night in early spring, more than 20 years after Grandpa Jones's passing. The rain came down in relentless sheets, driven sideways by gusts that howled through the holler. Lightning lit up the hills like midday, followed by cracks of thunder that shook the ground. Out in the clearing, the cabin stood as it always had, silent, unyielding, until the wind found a weakness. A massive oak limb, swollen with water, tore free and crashed down onto the roof with a sound like the crack of a gun. The next morning, when the family ventured out to assess the storm damage, they saw the beam of the porch roof splintered in two. The doorframe was warped from the impact, the rusted padlock dangling uselessly from a twisted hasp. For the first time in living memory, the cabin could be entered without force. The family gathered, staring at the door as if it were the mouth of some sleeping animal. There was hesitation in the air, an unspoken question hanging heavy between them. Should they go inside? Some argued they should call a local historian, preserve it as it was. Others felt they had to look, if only to repair whatever damage the storm had caused. Curiosity began to outweigh caution. They fetched flashlights, unsure what they'd find beyond the threshold. Most expected little more than dust, cobwebs, and maybe a few forgotten instruments. Yet as the first beam of light cut into the darkness, the air seemed to thicken, carrying with it a scent neither fully familiar nor entirely foreign, a mix of old wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic. It was in that moment, before even stepping inside, that a strange and almost imperceptible sense of dread settled over them, a feeling that whatever waited beyond that doorway was not meant to be disturbed. The first footstep onto the warped wooden floorboards echoed louder than it should have, as if the cabin itself had been holding its breath for decades and now exhaled in protest. Dust swirled in the flashlight beams, the particles thick and slow-moving, disturbed from a long and undisturbed rest. The air was heavy, oppressive, carrying layers of scent that seemed to tell their own story. Damp earth from the foundation, the sweetness of rotting wood, and beneath it all, a faint coppery tang that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Against the far wall sat a small wooden table, its surface bowed with age, holding a single kerosene lamp and a cracked ceramic mug with a dried ring of something long evaporated. Next to it, an old rocking chair rested at an odd angle, as if someone had pushed away from it in haste and never returned. But what drew their eyes almost immediately were the shelves lining the left wall. They were neatly stacked with glass jars, dozens of them, their lids rusted but sealed. Inside, preserved fruits floated in syrup gone dark with time. Peaches, apples, cherries, frozen relics from a kitchen that had stopped cooking long ago. Behind the jars, however, was something no one expected. Row after row of thick, spiral-bound notebooks. Each bore a hand-lettered label on the cover, dated meticulously in Grandpa's careful script, the earliest from 1953, and the latest from just months before his passing in 1998. At first glance, they looked like songbooks or maybe set lists for performances. But as one was opened under the dim beam of a flashlight, its contents quickly dispelled that notion. These weren't lyrics. They weren't comedy sketches. The pages were filled with journal entries, sometimes written in complete, steady sentences, other times in frantic, scrawled lines that veered into the margins. He wrote about things he claimed to have seen in the woods, late at night. Tall figures standing just beyond the tree line, their shapes blurred like heat ripples, watching in silence. There were sketches, too, crude but unsettling. Elongated limbs, faces stretched into unnatural expressions, eyes drawn as empty circles or black voids. Some pages contained what looked like maps of the property, marked with X's and notes like, "Don't go here after dark," or "Movement spotted 2:14 a.m." One journal was devoted entirely to what he called the Watchers, describing them as neither animal nor human, but something in between, moving without sound, vanishing if approached. And then there were the warnings, phrases repeated over and over across different years, always in the same tense, urgent tone. Don't let them in. Never open the door after midnight. They know when you're alone. The deeper they went into the shelves, the more journals they found, each one more intense, the handwriting shakier, as if fear itself had begun to erode his composure. By the time the last notebook was set down, the family wasn't just unsettled, they were rattled. These weren't the ramblings of a stage character or an old man telling tall tales. They felt like the desperate records of someone trying to document or survive, something he couldn't fully explain. They might have missed it if the room hadn't gone so still that even the ticking of an unseen clock seemed loud, a faint wobble underfoot each time someone passed the rocking chair. On the third pass, the floorboard sighed, not with age but with hollowness, and a sliver of darkness flashed at the seam. A screwdriver from a pocket knife was enough. The plank lifted with a sticky pull like peeling old paint, and the smell that rose from beneath was colder than the room itself, a sealed breath from another decade. Inside, nested in dust, the color of fireplace ash, lay a metal box no bigger than a loaf of bread. Its corners were blunted from use, its surface mottled with the green-black patina of time, and a tiny brass hasp, long since frozen, held it shut like a clenched jaw. They pried it open, and the lid gave with a rasp, revealing a careful, alarming order. A parcel of Polaroids tied with twine, a folded oilcloth bundle, a small Bible with corners frayed to threads, and something wrapped in muslin that looked like it belonged in a museum drawer, not a family cabin. The Polaroids came first. The earliest were dated in pencil along the white margins. June 57, October 62, new moon 3:11 a.m., and nearly all were taken at the edge of the property. The oak grove, the creek bend, the fence line where the land met the timber. Most frames were empty at first glance, just trees and night. But when the flashlight held steady and the eye adjusted, shapes emerged at the margins. Too tall for deer, too narrow for men, silhouettes that seemed to tilt toward the camera as if aware of being watched. On some, lines of white blur sliced across the image like scratches. On others, the foliage warped into a smear around a fixed, darker core, the lens fighting to capture something it didn't understand. One photo, circled in ballpoint on the margin, showed a figure half hidden behind a trunk, a vertical absence more than a body. Grandpa's handwriting beneath it read, "Closer than they've ever come." The oilcloth concealed a pocket knife and a length of twine knotted in odd intervals, each knot lacquered hard as if dipped in resin. The knife's bone handle was smooth from long carry. Its blade, pitted and blackened, bore a brittle crust that flaked when touched, leaving a faint metallic scent on the air that no one wanted to identify. Tucked with the knife was a penciled note for cutting circles, never straight lines. The Bible fell open to a page stiff with repeated handling. In the margin, beside a verse about watchmen on the wall, Grandpa had written a single word in firm print, countermeasure, but it was the muslin-wrapped bundle that drew every eye. The cloth came away to reveal a hand-stitched doll, 8 inches tall, the kind a child might have made if a child had only shadows for teachers. Its body was burlap filled with something that crunched faintly when pressed. Its crude mouth was a red cross stitch pulled too tight, as if silence had been sewn on. 2 mismatched buttons formed the eyes, one glossy black, one missing entirely, leaving a caved-in socket that made the face look forever turned to one side. Around its neck was a paper tag looped with twine, the cursive faded but legible, "Watcher." On the doll's back, a circle had been stitched in dark thread, not quite closed, with 3 short tails trailing off its edge like broken clock hands. The room seemed to contract around the tiny thing, as if its size had tricked them into lowering their guard. Someone whispered that they should put it back. Someone else said they needed to know why it existed at all. Beneath the doll, at the bottom of the box, lay a final item, a single brass key on a leather thong stamped with a symbol that matched the broken circle on the doll. The key's teeth were oddly filed, notched in a pattern that looked more like a sigil than a lock solution. When they lifted it, the air near the far corner of the cabin felt cooler, and the flashlight beam picked out a squat reel-to-reel machine half swallowed by shadow, its reels webbed with dust, but still threaded with tape, as if someone had stopped mid-sentence and meant to return. The key lay warm in a palm gone clammy with sweat, and for a long moment no one spoke. Whatever Grandpa had locked away in here wasn't just objects. It was instruction, ritual, warning, and if the journals were the map, the box was the toolkit. All that remained was the voice, the reason behind the rules, waiting in the machine that could finally tell them what he hadn't dared to say out loud. They cleared a space around the reel-to-reel, brushing away spider webs that snapped like threads of sugar, and eased the machine onto the table beneath the kerosene lamp as if it were a sleeping animal that might wake mean. The power cord was cloth-wrapped and brittle, but the outlet still hummed. When the switch clicked, the capstan rolled, and the room filled with a hush that didn't belong to the present. Thin static, a slow, mechanical breath, and then his voice, unmistakable even through the years. Grandpa, but without the grin, without the stage bright in it. "If you're hearing this," he said, low and close, "it means the circle didn't hold." A fingernail tapped the microphone. 1, 2, 3, and a chair creaked as if he'd leaned forward until his mouth almost touched the metal. "I tried to keep it light," he went on, "tried to keep the laughter louder than the night. But the night learns your habits. The night memorizes your roots." Paper rustled. A match flared, hissed, went quiet. In the background, faint as breath on a window, a plucked banjo string sounded once and died. Not music, but a test of the room. "They like edges," he whispered. "Windows, door frames, the thresholds where a man thinks he can be both inside and out. That's where they stand. That's where they watch." He described the first time he'd seen one plane, not in a trick of fog or the corner of the eye, a shape taller than the pump house door, thin as a fence post, but wrong in its angles, as if joints had been added or miscounted. He spoke of the rules that had cost him sleep to learn. Never draw a straight line, only circles. Never leave a circle open. Never answer a knock after midnight, because it was never a knock, only a question asked with wood. The tape hiccuped, and his breathing grew uneven, the microphone catching the wet turn of his mouth. "If they call your name," he said, "they'll use a voice you wish you could hear again." For a moment, the room on the tape filled with hollow air, the kind of silence that grows when someone is listening for something they hope won't arrive. Then 3 raps, far away but clean, like knuckles on old oak. Grandpa's chair scraped. "Not tonight," he said to the door, not to the machine. The raps came again, nearer, and a second sound followed. 3 gentle scritches, chalk on wood, a circle drawn and left open. The lamp on the table flickered, here and now, as if remembering. "I made a watcher," Grandpa said, voice steadying by will alone. "Stitched it from the sack. I carried seed in the year the creek rose. Button for an eye, key to mark the heart. I don't know if it keeps them out, or only keeps me from forgetting they're already in." Pages turned. The banjo string was plucked again. 2 notes, then another, forming a shape more than a melody, a round of sound that overlapped its own tail. "If the cabin's been opened, rethread the tape and listen to the end," he said. "There's a place by the north wall where the cold comes through. That's not a gap in the chinking. That's where they lean." As if cued by the past, a draft slid across the listening family's ankles, and someone shivered without choosing to. On the tape, a clock chimed. 1, then 2. Though no clock in the cabin had hands left to lift. "When the hour turns," Grandpa said, softer now, "they trade faces. They pick a person you trust, the boy at the feed store, your own father, a voice from the radio, and they borrow it like a coat. You'll want to open the door just to be polite. Don't." The machine clicked as if a splice passed over the head, and suddenly, the sound inside the cabin changed. The thinness of the room thickened, the microphone catching a pressure shift that made every listener's ear pop. Then a small voice said, plain as day, "Daddy?" And the family around the table flinched, because it was a voice they knew, a cousin's child long since grown, an old recording of a little girl they had heard on other tapes from other Christmases. "Go on," Grandpa told the machine, but he was speaking to himself. "Keep the circle closed." A dull bang shook the audio, followed by a scrape. Furniture dragged to brace a door, and the hiss of the tape swelled until it was almost a whistle. Over it, he prayed. No theatrics, just the short working prayer of a man who's got jobs left to do. The knocks slowed, the scritches faded, and then, very close to the mic, he said the last words before the first reel ended. "If you love me, leave it locked." The room here snapped back into its own quiet, the reel ticking its tail around the hub. Someone reached for the stop button, and another hand caught their wrist. There was more tape yet on the second reel. Dust dulled, but wound tight as a secret, and whatever Grandpa had not dared to say out loud was coiled there, waiting to be pulled across the head and turned back into a voice. "Do we play it?" someone asked, but the answer was already sliding toward them from the far corner by the north wall where the cold was, a place the flashlight didn't want to touch, and the circle on the floor, once closed, looked notched open by a hand no one owned. The second reel stayed in its cradle, untouched for the moment, while the family tried to process what they had just heard. The cabin no longer felt like a forgotten outbuilding. It felt like the center of something, a place where invisible lines converged. They began laying out the journals on the table, flipping through pages, comparing dates, cross-referencing them with the Polaroids and the notes in the box. Patterns started to emerge. The entries mentioning the Watchers, often lined up with real events recorded in old newspapers, livestock mutilations in nearby farms, unexplained brush fires that destroyed whole patches of woodland, hikers and campers who vanished without a trace in the Cumberland foothills. Grandpa had circled those dates in red pencil, jotting in the margins things like "closer than before" or "wrong season for them to be this far down." The Polaroids told their own story. When arranged in chronological order, the figures in the tree line seemed to draw nearer over the years, starting as faint distortions, then silhouettes, then shapes with hints of faces that were almost human, but not quite right. Eyes too far apart, mouths too thin and horizontal. One photo in particular caught everyone's attention, taken from inside the cabin looking out through a crack in the boarded window. It showed the clearing on a foggy night. At first it seemed empty, but zooming in revealed not one figure but three, standing in a perfect triangle formation, all facing the cabin. The journals described Grandpa's nightly walks around the property as patrols, his lantern not a quaint habit, but a tool for checking the perimeter, marking the soil with those strange circles he'd mentioned on the tape. Some of the notes sounded less like observation and more like combat reports. Phrases such as "repelled tonight" or "took the long way around fence line." In one of the later notebooks, his handwriting grew erratic, and certain words were underlined so heavily the paper tore. "They know me now. They can use her voice. Never open the north wall." Ramona's recollection of him disappearing into the woods for hours suddenly took on new weight, as did the locals' stories of seeing light flickering inside the cabin when no one was supposed to be there. Every artifact, every scrap of paper seemed to point to the same disturbing possibility. Grandpa Jones hadn't been keeping people out of the cabin to protect his privacy. He'd been keeping something else from getting in. And maybe, just maybe, it hadn't been entirely successful. That realization settled over the room like a cold draft, the kind you don't feel on your skin so much as deep in your chest. And in the corner, the second reel of tape waited, silent, as if daring someone to play it. They debated for hours before anyone touched the second reel. Some argued it should stay where it was, that Grandpa's last words, "If you love me, leave it locked," were meant for more than just the cabin door. Others insisted that whatever was on that tape might explain everything, give them a way to put the fear to rest. In the end, curiosity won. They threaded the tape with careful hands, the reel turning slowly until the first sound emerged, a faint, steady hum, like wind funneled through a narrow gap. Then Grandpa's voice returned, quieter this time, almost resigned. "If you've come this far," he said, "you've seen enough to understand. They don't go away. They don't tire. They wait." He spoke of how it had begun one night in the mid-1950s, when he was walking home from a late show and heard what he thought was Ramona calling from the woods. The voice was perfect, every inflection right, except for one thing. It used a name she hadn't called him since before they were married. That night, he saw the first shadow shift between the trees, too thin to be a man, too tall to be a deer. From that moment on, the cabin became his outpost. Every journal, every photo, every stitched circle was part of a defense against something no one would believe if he told them outright. His voice wavered when he described the trade, how the watchers didn't always come for people directly. Sometimes they took things instead: a neighbor's dog, a flock of chickens, the sound of the creek for a week straight. And sometimes, he whispered, they take your sleep until you don't know if you're dreaming them or they're dreaming you. There was a long pause on the tape, broken only by the sound of a chair creak, and then the voice returned, strained. I think they've marked me. They're patient. They'll outlast me. But if you keep the circle closed, they might not outlast you. What followed was a series of instructions, some clear, some cryptic. Never burn the doll. Always replace the button eye if it's lost. Pour salt in the cracks by the north wall before the first frost. Never answer a voice from outside unless you see the speaker's eyes in full daylight. And then the sound changed. A faint tapping, deliberate, from inside the cabin itself. Not on the tape, but there in the room where they were listening. Everyone froze. The machine kept turning, but the tape was silent now except for Grandpa's breathing, faster, ragged. Then his final words came, sharp and certain. If you hear them inside, it's already too late. The reel ended with a snap, the machine ticking as the tail spun loose. The cabin was quiet again, but the air had thickened, the kind of stillness that feels like it's holding something back. No one spoke as they packed the box, the journals, the Polaroids, and the tapes into sealed containers. The door was repaired, a new lock fixed in place, and the family agreed never to speak of what they'd found to anyone outside their own. But silence didn't erase the unease. Months later, a cousin staying overnight swore she saw a tall, unmoving figure at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. She blinked, and it was gone. But when she walked the fence line the next morning, she found a circle scratched into the dirt, not quite closed, with 3 short tails trailing off its edge, just like the one on the doll's back. Today, the cabin still stands, the key locked away in a place only 2 people know. Visitors claim they sometimes hear faint banjo music drifting from within, slow and deliberate. Nothing like the lively tunes Grandpa played for the world. Whether the cabin was the fortress of a man slipping into paranoia, or the last line of defense for someone who knew what hunted him, one truth remained. Those who stepped inside will never forget the feeling that something else was there with them, and whatever it was might still be waiting just beyond the tree line.